In 1903, a family smiles for the camera. Then, historians zoom in on the grandfather and discover a horrifying detail. Professor Amanda Rivers had been organizing historical donations at the Philadelphia Museum of American History for 8 years, but the collection that arrived on that crisp October morning would haunt her for months to come. The estate of recently deceased collector Harold Pembroke contained hundreds of early 20th century photographs, most documenting ordinary American families during the Industrial Age. One photograph immediately drew her attention, a formal family portrait from 1903, taken in what appeared to be an upscale photography studio. The image showed 3 generations of what seemed to be a prosperous family, a middle-aged couple, their 2 adult children with spouses, and 4 grandchildren ranging in age from toddler to teenager. At the center of the group sat an elderly man with a distinguished white beard, wearing a formal black suit. The family appeared happy and prosperous, typical of the emerging American middle class of the early 1900s. The women wore elaborate dresses with high lace collars, while the men sported well-tailored suits and carefully groomed mustaches. The children were dressed in their finest clothes, the boys in miniature suits, and the girls in pristine white dresses. But something about the photograph troubled Professor Rivers, though she couldn't immediately identify what. The lighting seemed odd, and there was an unusual stiffness to the grandfather's posture that went beyond the formal poses common to photography of that era. She placed the photograph under her magnifying glass for closer examination. The studio's stamp on the back read, Morrison Photography Studio, Philadelphia, PA, October 15, 1903. She made a note to research the studio's records, which were housed in the city's archives. As she prepared to file the photograph with the others, Professor Rivers took one more careful look. The grandfather's eyes seemed somehow different from those of the other family members, less focused, with an odd, glassy quality that made her uncomfortable. Something was very wrong with this seemingly innocent family portrait, and Professor Rivers was determined to discover what. The Morrison Photography Studio records, housed in Philadelphia's city archives, revealed meticulous documentation of every session conducted between 1895 and 1920. Professor Rivers found the entry for October 15, 1903. Family portrait. Whitmore family, 12 subjects, special arrangements requested. The notation, special arrangements, was unusual. Most family portraits in 1903 were straightforward affairs, but this entry included additional notes in the photographer's careful handwriting. Extended session required. Family requested extra time for positioning, full payment in advance. Professor Rivers contacted Dr. Michael Chen, a specialist in early photography techniques at Temple University. When she showed him the photograph, his reaction was immediate and troubling. The lighting on the grandfather is completely different from the rest of the family, Dr. Chen observed, adjusting his examination equipment. Look at how the shadows fall on his face compared to the others, and his eyes, they're not tracking the camera lens like everyone else's. Dr. Chen pointed out several other technical anomalies. The grandfather's skin had an unusual waxy quality, and despite the long exposure times required in 1903, he appeared unnaturally still compared to the slight movement blur visible on the children. There's something else, Dr. Chen continued, studying the photograph under different lighting conditions. His clothing appears to have been arranged very carefully. See how the jacket sits on his shoulders? That's not how fabric naturally falls on a living person. Professor Rivers felt a chill as the implications became clear. She requested the Morrison Studio's appointment books from the archives, hoping to find more information about the Whitmore family session. The appointment book revealed that the session had been scheduled 3 days in advance, with a notation that it was to accommodate a family emergency. The photographer had charged double his usual fee and had scheduled no other appointments that entire day. Most disturbing was a brief entry in Morrison's personal notes, found in a separate ledger. Unusual circumstances. Family requested complete discretion. Will not display sample in studio window as customary. The Whitmore family had paid extra for secrecy, and now Professor Rivers was beginning to understand why. City records from 1903 showed the Whitmore family as prominent members of Philadelphia society. Samuel Whitmore, the patriarch, was listed as the founder of Whitmore Textile Manufacturing. His son George and daughter Margaret had both married well, and the family lived in an elegant townhouse on Rittenhouse Square. But when Professor Rivers searched for death records, she made a shocking discovery. According to the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, Samuel Whitmore had died on October 12, 1903, 3 days before the family portrait was taken. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure and was signed by Dr. Edmund Foster, a prominent physician who served wealthy Philadelphia families. The timing was impossible to ignore. Samuel had died on October 12th, yet appeared very much present in a family photograph taken on October 15th. Professor Rivers contacted the Philadelphia Genealogical Society to research the Whitmore family further. The society's records indicated that Samuel's funeral had been unusually private, with only immediate family present and no public announcement in the newspapers until several weeks later. Local newspaper archives revealed another crucial detail. The Philadelphia Inquirer had published Samuel Whitmore's obituary on November 8, 1903, nearly a month after his actual death date. The delay was highly unusual for a man of his social prominence. The obituary described Samuel as a devoted family man, who had left detailed instructions for his family's future. It mentioned that he had been deeply concerned with preserving family unity and tradition, and had made specific requests regarding family remembrances. Dr. Chen's analysis of the photograph became even more significant in light of this discovery. If Samuel Whitmore died 3 days before this photograph was taken, he said, then what we're looking at is post-mortem photography, but disguised as a normal family portrait. The practice of photographing the deceased was common in the 1800s and early 1900s, but it was typically obvious that the subject had died. This photograph was different. It had been deliberately designed to make Samuel appear alive and present with his family. The question now was, why had the Whitmore family gone to such extraordinary lengths to create this illusion? Professor Rivers discovered the answer in Samuel Whitmore's will, filed with the Philadelphia Probate Court in November 1903. The document revealed a complex web of financial arrangements that explained the family's desperate need to conceal his death. Samuel's textile business was facing severe financial difficulties due to increased competition from Southern mills. His will indicated that he had borrowed heavily against the company, using his life insurance policy as collateral. The insurance company required proof that he was alive and in good health as of October 15, 1903, to validate the policy. More significantly, Samuel's largest creditor had demanded a personal meeting with him on October 20th, 1903, to renegotiate the company's debts. If Samuel failed to appear for this meeting, the creditor had the right to immediately seize all company assets, leaving the family destitute. The family portrait was not simply a memorial. It was evidence manufactured to support an insurance fraud. The Whitmore family needed documentation showing Samuel alive and well on October 5th to buy themselves time to arrange their affairs before revealing his death. Professor Rivers found additional evidence in the Morrison Photography Studio's financial records. The Whitmore family had paid not only for the photography session, but also for the photographer's complete silence about the unusual circumstances. Morrison had been compensated handsomely to ensure the secret would never be revealed. The fraud had worked. Insurance company records showed that Samuel's life insurance policy had been paid out in full in January 1904, and the family had successfully negotiated a settlement with their creditors that allowed them to retain a portion of their wealth. But the psychological cost on the family had been enormous. Professor Rivers found evidence in subsequent city records that showed the Whitmore family had been deeply traumatized by the experience. George Whitmore had sold the textile business within a year and moved his family to California. Margaret had suffered what contemporary records described as a nervous breakdown and had been treated at a private sanitarium. The children in the photograph, forced to pose with their deceased grandfather and maintain the secret, had carried the trauma into their adult lives. James Morrison's private journals, discovered among his business papers, revealed the moral struggle he faced when the Whitmore family approached him with their request. As a respected photographer who had built his reputation on honest portraiture, Morrison was deeply conflicted about participating in the deception. His journal entry from October 13, 1903, 2 days before the session, showed his internal turmoil. The Whitmore family has approached me with a most unusual request. They wish to create a family portrait that includes their recently deceased patriarch. While postmortem photography is not uncommon, they specifically want the deceased to appear alive and natural. This troubles my conscience greatly. Morrison had initially refused the commission, but the family's desperation and the substantial payment they offered eventually persuaded him. His technical skills as a photographer made him uniquely qualified to create the illusion the family needed. The process had been elaborate and disturbing. Morrison's journals described how Samuel's body had been carefully prepared by an undertaker, skilled in making the deceased appear lifelike for viewing. Special supports had been constructed to hold Samuel's body in a natural sitting position, and his eyes had been propped open with small devices used in post-mortem photography. The most challenging aspect had been coordinating the family's expressions and poses to appear natural while sitting next to their deceased patriarch. Morrison noted that the younger children had been deeply frightened by the experience, and several family members had become physically ill during the session. The session required 4 hours to complete, Morrison wrote. The family members struggled to maintain composure, particularly when posing the children close to their grandfather. George Whitmore fainted twice and had to be revived with smelling salts. Morrison had used his most advanced lighting techniques to minimize the obvious signs of death, carefully positioning Samuel to hide the stiffness of rigor mortis and using makeup to restore some color to his complexion. The photographer's guilt about the deception haunted him for years. His journals showed that he never again accepted a commission involving post-mortem photography, and he carried the secret of the Whitmore portrait until his death in 1925. Professor Rivers located descendants of the Whitmore family through genealogy websites, hoping to learn more about how the secret had affected the family in subsequent years. What she discovered revealed the long-term psychological impact of the deception on multiple generations. Thomas Whitmore, Samuel's great-grandson, still lived in the Philadelphia area and possessed family documents that had never been made public. When Professor Rivers contacted him, he was initially reluctant to discuss his family's history, but eventually agreed to share what he knew. The family never spoke openly about grandfather Samuel's death, Thomas explained during their meeting. but there were always whispers and strange behaviors that made more sense once I learned the truth. My grandmother Margaret never allowed family photographs to be taken, and she would become extremely agitated whenever anyone mentioned Samuel. Thomas showed Professor Rivers a collection of letters written by family members in the years following 1903. The correspondence revealed deep psychological trauma, particularly among the children who had been present for the photograph. Young Robert Whitmore, who had been 12 at the time, wrote to a cousin in 1905, "I still have nightmares about that day. Mother says I must never tell anyone about grandfather's photograph, but it haunts my dreams. I cannot look at pictures of grandfather without remembering how cold his hand felt when they positioned us." Margaret Whitmore's medical records, which Thomas had inherited, showed that she had been treated for what doctors of the era called nervous exhaustion and melancholia for several years after 1903. Her symptoms included an inability to tolerate being photographed and severe anxiety attacks triggered by discussions of death or funeral services. The family's financial situation had stabilized after the insurance payout, but the emotional cost had been devastating. George Whitmore had struggled with guilt for years, eventually becoming a heavy drinker. His marriage had deteriorated, and he had died relatively young in 1919. "The secret poisoned our family for generations," Thomas told Professor Rivers. "Even those of us born decades later grew up feeling that something terrible had happened, though we didn't know what. It's almost a relief to finally understand the truth." Professor Rivers decided to research whether the insurance fraud had ever been detected or investigated. She contacted historical researchers at Mutual Life Insurance Company, the firm that had paid Samuel Whitmore's policy in 1904. The insurance company's archives revealed that they had indeed become suspicious about the claim, but not until several months after the payout had been made. An internal memo dated March 1904 noted irregularities in the Whitmore claim and recommended a review of the case. The investigation had been prompted by an anonymous letter received by the insurance company in February 1904. The letter, written in careful handwriting, claimed that Samuel Whitmore had died before the date listed on his policy renewal document. However, the company's investigators had been unable to substantiate these claims. The insurance investigators' report, filed in April 1904, concluded that while there were unusual circumstances surrounding the claim, there was insufficient evidence to prove fraud. The family portrait from October 15, 1903, served as crucial evidence that Samuel had been alive and well on the policy renewal date. Most intriguingly, the company's files contained a notation that photographer James Morrison had been interviewed as part of the investigation. Morrison had maintained that the photograph was genuine and that Samuel Whitmore had been present and alert during the session. Morrison's loyalty to his clients had protected the family's secret, even under official investigation. The photographer had risked his reputation and potentially criminal charges to maintain the deception he had helped create. The anonymous letter that had triggered the investigation remained a mystery. Someone close to the family had known the truth and had attempted to expose the fraud, but their identity was never discovered. Professor Rivers suspected that the letter had come from within the family itself, possibly from someone who couldn't live with the guilt of the deception but lacked the courage to come forward publicly. The investigation files also revealed that Mutual Life Insurance Company had quietly changed their policies after the Whitmore case, requiring medical examinations closer to policy renewal dates and implementing more stringent verification procedures. As Professor Rivers pieced together the complete story, she struggled with her own ethical responsibilities regarding the discovery. The Whitmore family's fraud had occurred over 120 years ago, far beyond any legal statute of limitations, but the implications of exposing the truth remained complex. She consulted with museum ethicists and legal experts about whether to publish her findings. The consensus was that the historical significance of the case outweighed privacy concerns for the long-deceased individuals involved, but she should be sensitive to living descendants. Thomas Whitmore, when asked about public disclosure, gave his permission for the story to be told. "Our family has carried this burden for too long," he said. "Maybe sharing the truth will help other people understand the terrible costs of deception, even when the motives seem justified." Professor Rivers also consulted with experts in historical photography and fraud investigation. Dr. Chen's technical analysis of the photograph became a valuable case study for identifying similar deceptions in historical images. This case illustrates how sophisticated photographic fraud could be in the early 1900s. Dr. Chen explained, "While we think of image manipulation as a modern digital phenomenon, skilled photographers of that era could create convincing illusions using purely optical and chemical techniques." The story also highlighted the economic vulnerabilities of early 20th century families. Without modern social safety nets, the Whitmore family had faced complete financial ruin if Samuel's death had been revealed at the wrong time. Their desperate act reflected the harsh economic realities of the industrial age. Professor Rivers reached out to contemporary fraud investigators who found the case fascinating from a historical perspective. The Whitmore family's scheme demonstrated sophisticated planning and execution, requiring coordination between multiple parties over several months. "What strikes me most about this case," said retired insurance investigator David Martinez, is how the family's need for the deception created a web of trauma that affected multiple generations. The immediate financial crisis was resolved, but the psychological damage lasted for decades. The case became a powerful example of how secrets, even those kept for apparently justifiable reasons, can cause long-term harm to families and communities. Professor Rivers presented her findings at the American Historical Association's annual conference, where the Whitmore case generated significant interest among scholars studying early 20th century American social and economic history. The story illuminated several important historical themes that resonated with contemporary audiences. The case demonstrated the precarious financial situation many middle-class families faced during the industrial age. Despite appearing prosperous, the Whitmore family had been one business downturn away from poverty, illustrating the economic vulnerabilities that led to the eventual creation of modern social insurance programs. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a specialist in historical economics, noted that the Whitmore case was representative of broader patterns. Many seemingly successful families of this era were actually living on the edge of financial disaster. The lack of social safety nets meant that a breadwinner's death could instantly destroy a family's economic security. The story also provided insights into early 20th century photography practices and the relationship between technological advancement and potential for deception. Photography historians found Morrison's techniques fascinating, as they demonstrated sophisticated understanding of lighting and composition that challenged assumptions about early photographers' technical abilities. Child psychologists studying historical trauma found the case particularly significant for understanding how family secrets affect children across generations. The Whitmore children's experiences illustrated the long-term psychological costs of forcing young people to participate in family deceptions. The children in that photograph were traumatized not just by their grandfather's death, but by being forced to pretend he was alive, explained Dr. Gregor Sarah Kowalski, who specialized in childhood trauma. They had to maintain a secret that contradicted their own sensory experience, which creates profound psychological conflict. The case study became part of training materials for insurance investigators, illustrating how historical fraud techniques might provide insights into contemporary schemes. Despite the technological differences, the fundamental human motivations and psychological pressures that drove the Whitmore family's deception remained relevant. Museums across the country requested copies of the photograph and documentation for exhibitions about American family history, economic hardship, and the intersection of photography and truth. 2 years after her initial discovery, Professor Rivers received a letter that brought the Whitmore story full circle. It came from Rebecca Whitmore Chen, a great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Whitmore who had read about the case in a history magazine. Learning the truth about that photograph finally explained so many things about our family. Rebecca wrote, "My great-grandmother used to have panic attacks whenever anyone wanted to take family pictures. She would never explain why, and we thought she was just eccentric. Now I understand that she was probably one of the children in that 1903 photograph. Of course, Rebecca had inherited several family photographs and documents that she offered to donate to the Philadelphia Museum. Among them was a letter written by Margaret Whitmore in 1925, shortly before her death, that provided the final piece of the puzzle. In the letter addressed to her son but never sent, Margaret had written, 'The photograph haunts me still. Father looked so peaceful in death, but forcing him to appear alive for that picture felt like disturbing his rest. I fear we committed a sin that our family has never been able to escape.' Margaret's letter also revealed that she had been the one who sent the anonymous tip to the insurance company in 1904. Her guilt over the deception had driven her to attempt to expose the fraud, though she hadn't had the courage to come forward publicly. The Whitmore case became a permanent exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum titled Hidden Truths When Photographs Lie. The display included not only the original 1903 photograph, but also the complete documentation of Professor Rivers' investigation, Morrison's journals, and family letters. The exhibition included interactive elements that taught visitors how to identify signs of post-mortem photography and other forms of early photographic manipulation. It became one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing visitors interested in both history and the nature of truth in images. Most importantly, the Whitmore family's story served as a cautionary tale about the long-term costs of deception, even when motivated by desperation. The immediate crisis that drove their fraud had lasted only months, but the psychological damage had affected multiple generations. Thomas Whitmore attended the exhibition's opening ceremony, where he spoke about his family's experience. This photograph represents both our ancestors' love for each other and their tragic inability to face the truth. By finally sharing their story, we hope to honor both their memory and the importance of honesty, even in the most difficult circumstances. The case study continued to influence various fields, from insurance investigation to family therapy to historical photography. Samuel Whitmore's posthumous portrait, created in desperation and hidden for over a century, had become a powerful reminder that truth, however painful, ultimately serves families and communities better than even the most well-intentioned deceptions.